Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Joan Ganz Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Malkin Fund, the May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, the JoAnn and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and my guest today is a retired former colleague of mine at Rutgers University, Jerome Aumente, Distinguished Professor Emeritus in the School of Communication and Information. Now, Jerry has spent many years studying both journalism and journalists abroad, as well as the perils that those who report on the world outside, an anachronistic phrase if ever I've used one, do now face in gathering the news of the day. He has examined as well what new training, international education, and cultural opportunities America's journalism schools must provide to meet such international challenges. And in 2008, Professor Aumente's book, From Ink on Paper to the Internet, won the Societies of Professional Journalists National Award for Journalism Research, leading me to begin our program today by asking my guest just how well we're doing in adapting to the new media and to the new dangers abroad. How well are we doing, Jerry?
I think we're out of our period of denial. There was a time when the whole journalism structure was falling like a rock, and we were basically saying, well, this is just a little bit of a problem. But I think we're at a point now when we realize that in a sense, the whole journalistic ecosystem has changed. If you look at the numbers, I mean, in the last 10 years, 1 of every 5 journalism positions at newspapers has disappeared. Circulation of newspapers has dropped something like 30%. The amount of money that we spend on journalism in a sense of investigative, long-form kinds of reporting, specialized reporting, that's dropped about $1.6 billion a year in the last 5 years. So that basically we've had especially in the print industry, we've had a sense of someone who's on life support suddenly finding the electricity failing during a hurricane. You know, the economy came down on top of everything else. The problem basically is that I think much of the print and broadcast media, news media, were not aware of what was happening to them. They were in a period of denial. I wrote an earlier book in 1987. It was called New Communication Pathways, and it looked at video text and teletext and online databases, basically looking at electronic publishing. This was a very critical time for the news media to be able to really take hold of what was becoming a digital world. It was at the beginnings of it. And they totally denied it. They basically said it's going to go away. I mean, there was sort of the so-called imperial media, the old media, if you want to call it that, the legacy media. There are all kinds of euphemisms for it, but basically many of the papers, many of the radio and television stations simply said it's going to go away. It's not going to happen. You know, the digital world is not going to change us. I was struck by the arrogance of the media at that point. When they were trying to develop electronic publishing and online services, they segregated and put they were not journalists. They were not considered journalists. They were put in another building. They couldn't be in the newsroom. If you look at some of the early experiments with AP and others, they were sort of rejoicing in the fact that this thing was failing. So just at the point when they could have wrapped their arms around it and really done something differently, they missed. And now they're trying to catch up. The New York Times is hoping that it will be able to get some money by charging for its service starting in early next year. We have Rupert Murdoch insisting that he's going to put paywalls around everything. All of this is so difficult to sort of sort out. And then we come to the other issue of how do we train and how do we educate for this? What should the universities be doing? What should I be doing? What should other journalism trainers be doing when we go overseas? I've been overseas about 170 times now doing programs. We established in 1989 after the Soviet bloc came apart with the solidarity elections in Poland. We moved in and spent a lot of time doing fundamentals of journalism. I remember a Polish journalist, a well-respected, someone I know, who's a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. I was talking to him one day when we were starting our programs, and I said to him, what can be most helpful to you? And he said, look, we know the fundamentals of good and bad journalism. The problem is that for the last 20 years we've been interviewing on our knees. And we need a change in attitude. We need to be aggressive. We need to do investigative reporting. We need to do long-form reporting. And we started doing that. We basically worked with young people to...
started doing it overseas, helping them do it overseas.
And if I go from 1989 to 2010, and then I ask myself, what should I be doing now? And this is the basis of the research I'm doing in terms of journalism training, both in the U.S. and overseas. Again, that ecosystem of journalism has changed totally, and we have to look not only at what is happening overseas, but what is happening here. The issue of safety is always an important one.
Well, how do you? To me, that's so important. How do you train? How do you help prepare people for what seems to me to be an absolutely extraordinary increase in the dangers in which journalists work now?
Well, there are a number of ways to approach that. One is to actually, there's a checklist, a safety checklist, in a sense that one can go through in terms of what you should do or not do if you're a journalist anywhere, whether you're from the U.S. or whether you're from Serbia, whether you're from Poland, whether you're from Thailand. They're the fundamentals of how to protect yourself. But beyond that, I think that what we need to do, and I've been doing a lot of writing about this in Nieman Reports in the winter issue, and then also with Quill magazine in last summer, the idea that journalism trainers, in fact, have to start training themselves or become aware of the fact that when they walk into a room with 30 Iraqi journalists, the way I did in Beirut, Lebanon, 2 years ago, I'm dealing not only with information, but I'm dealing with a whole life form there that is really in danger. And a good example of that is the Iraqi television journalist Muntada al-Zaidi. This was about 3 weeks before he threw his shoes at Bush in Beirut. I'm sorry, in Baghdad. But we were in Beirut. He came up to me the first day of class and said, I need your help. I didn't know him. I'd never met him. I had some background on the people in the class, but very general. And he said, I'm suffering really from post-traumatic stress. I'm really in trouble. He had been kidnapped probably by Al-Qaeda the year before, kept hostage and then released. He had been held under surveillance by the U.S. Army at another point in his life. And then suddenly he was trying to deal with all of this, and we spent a lot of time talking, and I tried to identify organizations in the United States that are really good at doing something about this. The Committee to Protect Journalists is a good example. We've done a lot of work on crossover work in terms of trying to support journalists.
Yes, but you talk about preparation, the journalist preparation, a checklist, etc. Yes. What kind of a checklist in a world that seems to be newsy in areas of great danger?
There are things that can be done, and if in terms of whether one is embedded with an armed forces kind of protection. There's another kind of wild, nobody knows Russian roulette kind of situation where every day, every second is, it can be Times Square, it can be downtown Baghdad, it can be Afghanistan. There's nothing you can do to protect against that, but what you can do is be sure that organizations that are dealing with journalists, Reporters Without Borders, Committee to Protect Journalists, International Center for Journalists, things like this, have the kind of backup that will allow, number one, a trainer like myself to realize that when I'm in a room like this and I'm working with journalists, I'm not only giving them fundamentals, but I'm also, in a sense, being a counselor. I mean, it's no different than what I do and what I did as a full-time faculty member or as a chair. I had students coming in all the time. The agenda was... They
weren't going out and getting shot at, Jerry.
No.
Not even on the Rutgers campus.
That's thankfully. But they were coming in, and basically they may ostensibly have had a problem with a paper or with finishing a course or something like this, but underneath that was a whole life of different kinds of problems that if you listen and if you really work with them, you begin to realize that with Muntada, for instance, the shoe thrower, 3 weeks later he just exploded in Beirut, and he threw these shoes at Bush. Thankfully, they didn't hit him. He wasn't killed. No one else was killed, either the president or the journalist or the other journalists in the room. But what was needed, I think, is a quick response kind of philanthropic foundation, quick response, some kind of a safety net for these journalists. I mean, we know that the journalists in Iraq are experiencing a lot of problems, much more than ordinarily. We know that their families need help. And let me give you another example. Just about the time that this happened with the shoe thrower, I was working with a group of, I'd done a series of about 8 programs in Washington and then overseas with journalists from the Middle East. In one of those programs, we met in the White House with George Bush, spent about 45 minutes with him. We went then invited into the Oval Office and had individual pictures taken, and the Iraqi journalist basically said to me, "We can't publicize this photograph." We had a group photo with him. We had individual photos. If this photo gets back out, if it goes out,
they're in danger.
They're really in danger. It was important for me to understand this. It was important for me, before we even had the meeting with Bush, I had to really talk with the 9 journalists, and they had to vote. They literally voted as to whether or not they would even have the meeting with him. And if the meeting was going to take place, which it did, what were the ground rules? And one of the ground rules simply was no publicity.
Well, Jerry, let me switch it a little and
Sure.
ask you about what's happened in the training of Americans to work overseas. American journalists are now so much more endangered than they ever were in our history. What's happened to, let's say, the numbers of the younger journalists who are willing to go overseas? Has that been affected at all?
It's been affected, yes, in 2 ways. One is that people are much more sensitive to the dangers. The other problem is, though, that the overseas assignments are shrinking and disappearing. I mean, we're looking at a news media in the United States that is shutting down its bureaus, shutting down its overseas expenses. I think I mentioned before that something like $1.6 billion a year is being cut. 30% has been cut out of budgets.
Can you measure that in the news that we Americans are getting on the air, in print?
Yeah, this is we're on a downward. I'm very much on a downward, both in content and quality. The money that's being cut out of the budgets for the newspapers and radio and television stations is the money that goes in for these long-form investigative pieces. The money that goes into not only investigative but other kinds of enterprise reporting, accountability reporting, and that I think maybe is a good point to then say, okay, how do we deal with this, and how do we deal with, and not only in training of journalists, but we have to be willing to understand that the whole news media landscape has changed. It used to be that the concept of interactivity between a reader and the newspaper was whether or not he or she could beg to get 2 paragraphs into the New York Times letter section. There's a whole world out there now of interactivity with 1 billion going on 2 billion people who are using the internet. The old methods don't work anymore, and I think that the journalism schools, which have tended to be the caboose at the end of the train, are starting to move up a little closer and may in fact become an engine of change instead of being in the back. And what that means basically is that we need to train journalists not only to be multimedia conscious, but also to start looking at whole new formats. I think that we talk about citizen journalism in sort of a disparaging kind of way, that it's a lot of people blogging with empty heads and then simply riffing off what happens to be the latest headline of the day. But there is a need for instance, if I were going to a foundation now or to a philanthropic individual, I would start talking about how do we change in the training, how do we start doing management and decision making, both for our journalists here in the United States and those overseas, to really deal with this. And this there's a whole array out there of things. One is that Columbia University recently did a really good report by Len Downey Jr. and by Michael Schutzen on restructuring journalism. And some of those recommendations are really worth thinking about. I mean, one is the idea that we need a change in our tax structure laws so that we can start supporting nonprofit or low-profit kinds of newspapers so that they can take money from sources that will help support them. I'd like to, I'm playing with an idea. I'm in the middle of doing some research on FDR and the CCCs back in the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Why can't we have a civilian communication corps? Why can't we have so many younger people out there now who are doing nothing, or maybe doing unpaid internships or whatever it happens to be. But how could we harness this really fantastic broadband world that we have, this digital world that we have, and start having people work on that? I mean, I would like to make a recommendation, for instance, that we create a senior media corps. There are all kinds of professors out there and teachers like myself who have had a lot of experience, a lot of journalists who are senior journalists who are, in fact, volunteering to do things. Perhaps we can look at what we have here in the way of an opportunity. The opportunity being we have an integrated two-way kind of way of developing information. But what it means is that, things like changing the tax laws, maybe creating, we have a National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, and they've been really wonderful in supporting a lot of media-related things. Maybe we have to start having a civilian communication corps. Maybe we need to have a National Endowment for News. The money could come from FCC might, in fact, be able to collect some of the money through broadcasting licenses, through a whole range of things. With this there are a series of problems, and it's always very dangerous to talk about all the opportunities. I mean, we had opportunities. CATV, I thought, when it first came out, was going to be a wonderful tool for people to open up new ideas and to open up local voices. That totally disappeared. We worked with local origination program people. We worked with municipalities to get them to write better ordinances that would allow for access to a channel, things like this. That's pretty much got wiped out. We have another chance, and probably an even more exciting chance with a very literate, digitally literate population. We have it tied into the schools. We have it tied into the libraries. What do we do with it? And this is what I think is really exciting about what is happening now. When you see something like ProPublica, the $10 million a year Paul Steiger operation, Paul being the former managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, being able to win a Pulitzer Prize in combination with the New York Times. So we have new structures. We have collaborative structures between new media, websites, things like this.
But at the same time, Jerry, we're dealing with the problem now of the news from outside of our own sphere of influence, which has become more and more limited to our shores, our boundaries. What about the news from overseas?
There are things that are number one, I think the universities have to do much more than they've done before. I think the universities are great warehouses of knowledge. And when we talk about overseas, I mean, you look at any one of the top tier or even middle tier universities, they're doing a lot of programs overseas. They're doing a lot of work in the field. They can bring to that knowledge to the discussion. But again, we need different kinds of formats so that the universities are engaged in this.
But in the meantime, what are our journalism schools doing about these young people who are coming to study with them, who in the past had a chance of going overseas and bringing back to us in this country news of the world outside?
There are some interesting experiments. One of them is a website called Global Post. It was formed by somebody previously was at the Boston Globe. And basically what they're doing is creating correspondence in 50 different countries. And then they're sending, Global Post is a functioning website now that is doing good work. And it has 50 correspondents that are sending information to this particular source. That's only one of hundreds that could be developed.
Now, are they sending locals or are they American would-be journalists?
It's a combination. Many of them are native locals, indigenous to the area, really know the area, know the language, which again solves the problem of parachute journalism. An American flying in for a week and a half and then doing a really, and I want to say not an authoritarian, but authoritative kind of report. I mean, we're getting that. There are a lot of young people who are starting sites and that are doing this. But again, I think what we have to do is say, okay, where do we need, where are the weaknesses in this whole ecosystem? And one of the weaknesses, as you point out, is the lack of international news, the lack of international sensibility. And there's no reason why we cannot have the long form, the investigative kind of approaches, the in-depth kinds of things. Thailand is a good example. I was there last November to do some workshops with health professionals and with journalists in terms of using the media. I am now in touch with a number of these people that I've met who are sending me daily reports of what is happening in Bangkok and in the rest of the country and what impact this has. If we can harness this, I mean, if we could, it's sort of scattered. It's all over the place now, and we need to give some kind of structure to it.
Are there any major structures in our country, and we have just a couple of minutes left, are there major foundations or other organizations that are striving to improve, given the situation as you described it, cutting back on the part of the press and of broadcasters on their news reports, that are trying to work out enabling us to become familiar with what's going on around the world?
There are some, not enough, not nearly enough. I think that I can mention different different websites that are doing this. The problem is that these websites pop up with all kinds of hope, and then 70 to 90% of the websites go down. I mean, we know that 5 to 10% probably are going to make it. But I think it needs an infusion of energy and of resources by foundations, by philanthropists. We do it in a government sense with the State Department. I mean, the individual embassies are basically sending Americans overseas and then doing a lot of international visitors here. That kind of interplay is, again, what I'm doing some research on now. How do we solidify that? For instance, I've had really good luck with having journalists who find that they're able to meet with the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC, the big players, and the big players are saying to us, "This is good for me. This is good for us." On the American side, we're learning about, in this case, the Middle East. We're learning about things about the Middle East that we didn't know before. We're developing contacts so that maybe someone can become a stringer in that particular area and provide information back to us. Now, all of that enriches the global sensibility, but it's not enough. I would also be concerned if not only about international, but what is happening to the accountability reporting, what is happening to the enterprise reporting in the United States. I mean, State House correspondents are disappearing like crazy. What kind of formats can we have so that we have universities becoming, through students and through faculty, becoming a source of information and a source of news? How about collaboration between the professionals and the amateurs? It's a very exciting time. I mean, it's a difficult time if you're in it, but it's a very exciting time.
Jerry, I hope you maintain your excitement while I guess maintain my usual pessimism about where we are and where we're going. Thank you so much for joining me again on The Open Mind.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
And thanks too to you in the audience. I hope you'll join us again next time. Meanwhile, as an old friend used to say, good night and good luck. And do visit the Open Mind website at theopenmind.tv. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Joan Ganz Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Malkin Fund, the May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, the JoAnn and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.